Adam Neumann's WeWork raised $12 billion from SoftBank's Vision Fund in 2019, and Masayoshi Son called him a next-level entrepreneur at the time. 18 months later, that valuation collapsed from $47 billion to under $8 billion. Neumann found himself forced out, and 12,000 employees watched their equity evaporate in real time. The organizational structure that destroyed WeWork mirrors one that failed on the Mongolian steppe in 1203, and a young warrior named Temüjin watched that failure unfold before building the largest contiguous land empire in human history by doing the exact opposite. Once you see what he understood about scaling that Silicon Valley forgot, you'll realize most tech companies are still repeating the 1203 mistake. This isn't about conquest. It's about the architecture of organizations that can grow without breaking. Most people get the Mongol story completely wrong, so let's start with what actually happened. The standard narrative credits Genghis Khan's success to brutality and overwhelming force, and historian Jack Weatherford, who wrote the definitive modern account of the Mongol Empire, calls this the most persistent myth in Asian history. Saying brutality explains Mongol success is like saying Amazon succeeded because they had a website, and it misses the entire point. When Temüjin united the Mongol tribes and took the title Genghis Khan in 1206, he faced an impossible problem. Maybe 1 million people lived in Mongolia at the time, while the Jin dynasty of northern China alone had over 50 million, and the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia had tens of millions more. He found himself outnumbered everywhere, always, by factors of 10 to 50. Brutality doesn't scale against those odds, but systems do. The failure Temüjin witnessed in 1203 involved the collapse of the Kereit confederation, a coalition of steppe tribes that fell apart the moment its leader Togrul Khan lost control. That structure depended on personal loyalty flowing through kinship and individual relationships, which meant the whole thing fragmented when the center couldn't hold. After unification, Genghis Khan's first move destroyed this model entirely. He reorganized the Mongol military around what historians call the decimal system, and it worked like this: forget your tribe, forget your bloodline, because you're now part of an arban, a unit of 10 soldiers. 10 arbans form a zuun of 100, 10 zuuns form a mingghan of 1,000, and 10 mingghans form a tumen of 10,000 warriors, operating as a single coordinated unit. This sounds simple, but here's the thing: it was actually revolutionary. Under the old tribal system, a commander's death meant his unit fell apart because the structure was personal and loyalty belonged to him rather than to a role. The decimal system created structure that existed independent of any individual, which meant when your arban commander died, someone stepped up, the structure remained, and the unit kept fighting. Nobody talks about this next part. Genghis Khan deliberately mixed tribes within these units. Your arban of 10 might include warriors from 5 different tribes that had been blood enemies a decade earlier, and this wasn't accident, it was strategy. Mixing backgrounds and forcing interdependence dissolves tribal loyalty and replaces it with unit loyalty, with organizational loyalty. You stop being a Temüjin or a Kereit and start being a Mongol soldier in the 3rd arban of the 7th zuun of the Borjigin tumen. A computer scientist named Melvin Conway observed something in 1967 that would later be called Conway's Law. Organizations design systems that mirror their communication structures. The Mongols understood this 7 centuries earlier, and they knew that coordinated output requires restructuring the organization itself rather than just demanding better collaboration from a fragmented structure. Every tech company talks about breaking down silos, about cross-functional teams, about company identity over team identity. Ping-pong tables and all-hands meetings represent their solution attempts. Genghis Khan solved it by restructuring the actual organization so that mixed background collaboration wasn't optional, it was how you survived. You're probably wondering how this connects to why your startup can't ship features, and the answer lies in communication infrastructure. This is where the YAM comes in, and this is where Silicon Valley should be taking notes. The YAM functioned as the Mongol postal relay system, with stations called established every 25 to 30 miles across the entire empire, each stocked with fresh horses, supplies, and riders. Historians estimate the system maintained over 10,000 relay stations at its peak, and a message could travel from Karakorum, the capital in central Mongolia, to the borders of Hungary in 2 weeks. No communication system would match this speed until the telegraph arrived 600 years later. Speed wasn't the point, though. Standardization was. Every station operated identically, every rider knew the protocol, and every message used the same format. A commander in Persia could send intelligence to generals in China using a system that worked exactly the same across 12 million square miles. Biologists have a term for this kind of architecture: mycelium networks. Underground fungal systems connect entire forests and allow trees to share resources and information without central coordination, with a tree in one part of the forest sending chemical signals to trees hundreds of meters away through these fungal highways. No central brain exists. No hierarchy routes everything through a single point. Just a network where any node can communicate with any other node through standardized biological protocols. The YAM functioned as organizational mycelium, and your company needs the same thing. Not a hierarchy that routes everything through the CEO, but a network that lets any node communicate with any other node through standardized protocols. Here's where it gets interesting. The YAM system isn't just about getting messages from point A to point B. It's the exact same principle that makes Amazon's 2 pizza teams work. The YAM had standardized interfaces between stations, and Amazon has standardized interfaces between teams. Each YAM station operated autonomously, but followed universal protocols, and each Amazon team owns their service, but follows company-wide API standards. Reliable information flow at scale was the YAM's goal, and reliable capability delivery at scale is Amazon's goal. The mechanism stays identical, only the materials change. Jeff Bezos didn't invent the 2 pizza team concept because he liked small meetings, and most people don't realize this. He mandated it because he understood that organizational scaling requires standardized, autonomous units with clean interfaces. That legendary 2002 internal memo from Bezos laid out the mandate. All teams will expose their data and functionality through service interfaces. Teams must communicate through these interfaces, no exceptions. His exact words for enforcement were that anyone who doesn't do this will be fired. That's the YAM. That's Genghis Khan's organizational architecture rebuilt for software. What happens when companies ignore this reveals why it matters. The first principle is autonomous units with standardized interfaces. Tumen commanders in the Mongol system had almost complete tactical autonomy. Genghis Khan and his generals would set strategic objectives like, take this city, control this trade route, neutralize this threat. But how the tumen accomplished those objectives remained up to the commander. This wasn't delegation through weakness, it was scaling through trust. A tumen operating in Persia might sit 2,000 miles from Karakorum, and by the time a message requesting permission reached headquarters and a response came back, the tactical situation would be completely different. Centralized command doesn't work at scale because information latency kills responsiveness. The Mongols pushed decision-making to the edge, trained commanders in strategic principles, gave them resources, and trusted them to execute. What got standardized and what didn't reveals the genius. Communication protocols went standardized, logistics formats went standardized, but tactical decisions stayed localized. Look at WeWork again through this lens. Adam Neumann built a company that scaled headcount to over 12,000 employees, but WeWork's organizational structure inverted the Mongol model. Major decisions flowed through Neumann personally, brand standards changed based on his whims, and no standardized interface existed between units because there was no trust in unit autonomy. Here's the strange thing. Neumann actually understood one Mongol principle intuitively. Culture matters. WeWork had incredibly strong culture, and the problem wasn't its absence. The culture was never encoded into structure because it lived in Neumann's head, in his energy, in his presence, which meant the organization had no operating system the moment he was removed. $18.5 billion. That's what Masayoshi Son poured into this architecture. He funded a medieval court and called it a tech company. Spotify offers a different model through their squad system. Spotify explicitly designed autonomous units called squads with standardized interfaces to the rest of the organization, where each squad owns a feature or component and has tactical autonomy, but they communicate through explicit protocols like guild meetings, chapter syncs, and standardized deployment pipelines. Spotify's founders are Swedish, and Sweden has a cultural concept called lagom that roughly translates as just the right amount, neither too much nor too little. The Mongols had the same intuition because they understood you standardize just enough to enable coordination without killing local responsiveness. Spotify built a YAM, and WeWork built a personality cult. The second principle hits harder: meritocratic advancement, independent of origin. One of Genghis Khan's most trusted generals went by the name Subutai, and he came from a blacksmith family rather than nobility or a powerful tribe. Under the old tribal system, horseshoes would have been his life's work. Genghis Khan didn't care about bloodlines. He cared about capability. Subutai rose to command tumens, then multiple tumens, and he planned and executed the Mongol invasion of Europe, including the Battle of Mohi in 1241, where Mongol forces destroyed the Hungarian army despite being outnumbered. Military historians place him alongside Alexander, Hannibal, and Napoleon as one of the greatest generals in human history. The Mongol system promoted based on demonstrated ability rather than lineage, and that's how he got there. The Yasa, Genghis Khan's legal code, explicitly forbade giving positions based on family connection alone. The Secret History of the Mongols, the oldest surviving Mongolian literary work, records this principle directly. Those who proved capable in small commands earned larger ones. Those who failed faced removal, regardless of bloodline. A commander's son who wanted to lead had to prove himself in battle first, starting at the bottom, demonstrating competence, and rising through the ranks. This sounds obvious now, but in the 13th century it was radical, and in the 21st century, most companies still don't actually practice it. The parallel in tech shows up clearly. Companies that scale successfully let the best ideas win regardless of source, while companies that stall let proximity to founders or tenure matter more than insight. Reed Hastings at Netflix institutionalized this with what he calls freedom and responsibility. Netflix famously pays top of market, fires adequate performers, and promotes based on impact rather than time served. Over 20 million views, that's how many times people have read the Netflix culture deck, which explicitly states they don't value loyalty in the traditional sense, only contribution. This feels harsh and uncomfortable, but it's exactly what allowed a DVD by mail company to become a streaming giant, to become a content production powerhouse. Each phase required different capabilities, and people who couldn't adapt got replaced by people who could. The Mongol Empire faced the same challenge, because conquering the steppe required different skills than administering China. Genghis Khan's successors, Ögedei, Möngke, and Kublai, kept promoting based on capability for new challenges rather than rewarding past loyalty. Uber, under Travis Kalanick, offers the contrast. Uber promoted people based on tribal loyalty, and early employees who matched Kalanick's aggressive style rose regardless of competence. The result was a company that won through brute force in the early days but couldn't adapt when the challenges changed, which meant they had to bring in Dara Khosrowshahi, an outsider with no tribal ties, to fix what the insider culture couldn't. The Mongols would have recognized Uber's problem immediately, because it's what happens when you organize around kinship instead of capability. It's the Kereit confederation all over again. The third principle involves strategic patience with tactical speed. The Mongol military moved faster than any army in history, covering 100 miles in a day when European armies moved 20. Their attacks seemed to come from everywhere at once, because their horses and logistics allowed speeds that defenders couldn't comprehend. Here's what gets overlooked. Months, and sometimes years of preparation came before any campaign. Before invading the Khwarezmian Empire, Genghis Khan sent merchants and spies for 2 years. They mapped trade routes along the Silk Road, catalogued defenses, and identified internal political divisions, which meant he knew the strengths and weaknesses of every major city before a single soldier crossed the border. 3 years. That's how long the invasion itself took. The preparation took longer. Fast execution paired with slow preparation, and this runs exactly backwards from how most startups operate. Reid Hoffman built LinkedIn on what he later called blitz scaling, which prioritizes speed over efficiency. Millions of copies sold, and the book became required reading in Silicon Valley, with the philosophy claiming that the company scaling fastest wins in winner-take-all markets, even if that scaling is inefficient or chaotic. Here's the contrarian read the Mongols would offer. Hoffman succeeded despite violating their principles rather than because of it. LinkedIn had network effects that forgave operational chaos because once you're the professional network, you're the professional network, and the moat compensates for the messy scaling. Most companies don't have that luxury. The Mongols would look at blitzscaling and see a philosophy that works only when you're lucky enough to have structural advantages that compensate for bad architecture. For everyone else, and that's almost everyone, strategic patience with tactical speed remains the superior approach. Silicon Valley culture worships speed with mantras like move fast and break things, ship it and iterate, launch now and fix later. The problem is, these mantras optimize for tactical speed while ignoring strategic preparation. Companies launch products nobody wants, pivot randomly when they don't work, and burn cash on customer acquisition before achieving product-market fit. And that's the result. Stripe's early years offer a contrast. Patrick and John Collison spent nearly 2 years building their payment infrastructure before aggressively pursuing growth, because they understood that payment processing is a trust-based system where breakage means merchants lose money and faith. They prepared obsessively, built redundancy, and mapped edge cases. Once the foundation was solid, they moved incredibly fast on execution. And Stripe's developer experience became legendary because they had time to make it elegant during the preparation phase, rather than shipping half-broken documentation with promises to fix it later. Subutai would have recognized this approach because you don't charge into battle until you know the terrain. But once you charge, you move faster than the enemy believes possible. The fourth principle covers scalable culture through codification. The Yasa wasn't just a legal code, it functioned as a cultural operating system. Conquering territory spanning from Korea to Poland means facing impossible diversity of languages, religions, and customs. Genghis Khan personally explaining values to every soldier wasn't possible, which meant he needed something that worked without the founder present. The Yasa established universal principles covering religious tolerance, protection of merchants and diplomats, rules for succession, and standards for military discipline. Comprehensiveness wasn't possible, but the invariants got established, the things that stayed true no matter where you were in the empire. The religious tolerance clause stands out as particularly striking because the Mongols didn't care what god you worshipped as long as you followed the organizational rules. This wasn't moral enlightenment, it was practical scaling, since religious persecution creates resistance while tolerance creates compliance. The Yasa encoded this insight into policy. 8 centuries later, Google's Project Aristotle research found that psychological safety, the belief that you won't be punished for speaking up, functions as the single most important factor in team effectiveness. The Mongols encoded a version of this into law because they understood that diverse teams need explicit protection to function. Local adaptation became possible while maintaining coherence, which meant a Mongol administrator in Persia and a Mongol administrator in China followed the same core principles, even though their local contexts differed completely. Netflix has the culture deck, Amazon has the leadership principles, and Bridgewater has Ray Dalio's principles document. These aren't HR exercises, they're Yasas, attempts to codify what would otherwise be tacit knowledge locked in founders' heads. Companies that fail to do this hit a predictable wall when they scale to about 150 people, which is Dunbar's number, the cognitive limit on relationships a human can maintain. Culture becomes incoherent. Decisions that used to be obvious become political, and values that were implicit become contested. Genghis Khan knew he couldn't be everywhere, which is why he built a system that carried his principles without requiring his presence. Most founders resist this because they want involvement in everything and think their personal judgment is irreplaceable. Their judgment is irreplaceable, and that's exactly why it needs encoding into something that doesn't depend on their presence. The fifth principle is what military historians call decentralized intent. Genghis Khan and his generals gave orders in a specific format. They specified the objective and the constraints, but not the method. Take this city, preserve the artisans, rejoin the main force by this date, and how you accomplish it is your problem. This is the opposite of micromanagement, but also the opposite of abdication, because it requires commanders who understand strategic intent well enough to make good decisions without guidance. Years of training built this capability among the Mongols. Young warriors started in arbans, learned the principles, demonstrated judgment, and gradually earned more autonomy, which meant by the time someone commanded a tumen, they had internalized the strategic logic so deeply that detailed instructions weren't necessary. This explains the real reason the Mongol military seemed almost telepathic in battle. Commanders at every level knew what the overall strategy required, and when circumstances changed, they adapted in coordinated ways because they shared a mental model. Amazon's concept of leaders are right. A lot represents the tech equivalent. Bezos doesn't mean leaders are never wrong. He means leaders develop judgment through experience and accountability until they can be trusted to make decisions without escalation. Companies that scale successfully push decision rights down, while companies that stall centralize decisions because they don't trust their people's judgment. Judgment is a skill that develops through practice, and never letting people make decisions means they never develop judgment, which means you can't trust them, which means you can't scale. The Mongols broke this loop by letting commanders fail on small stakes so they could succeed on large ones. Modern tech calls this high agency culture, and it's the same idea 800 years later. What Genghis Khan figured out in the 13th century, and what Silicon Valley is still learning, is that scaling isn't about control, it's about architecture. Autonomous units with standardized interfaces, meritocratic advancement, independent of origin, strategic patience with tactical speed, scalable culture through codification, and decentralized intent through trained judgment. These aren't separate ideas because they're all expressions of the same truth. Organizations that scale are organizations that work without the founder present. They're systems that produce good decisions from average people rather than requiring genius decisions from irreplaceable leaders. Jack Weatherford argues that the Mongol Empire created the first truly global system by connecting trade routes, communication networks, and administrative structures across larger territory than any organization before or since. Over a century after Genghis Khan's death, the empire still stood. Fragmentation came eventually, but not because the principles failed. It came because later leaders stopped following them. Here's my prediction based on Mongol principles. The next trillion-dollar company will come from founders who've never read a business book but deeply understand how the Mongols, the Roman legions, or the British East India Company actually operated. The playbook isn't in Y Combinator's startup school. It's in military history and organizational anthropology. It's in the structures that scaled before software existed. Next time you're thinking about how to scale your company, ask yourself whether a tumen commander in Persia could execute this strategy without checking in with headquarters. If the answer is no, you haven't built a scalable organization, you've built a personality cult with a product. The best companies aren't built with charismatic founders and visionary leadership, they're built with standardized interfaces and trained autonomy. Genghis Khan's empire outlasted him by generations, while most startups don't survive their founders going on vacation. You just didn't have the vocabulary for it until now. The Mongol Empire and Silicon Valley, two worlds that seem like they couldn't be more different, but the underlying principles of scaling connect everywhere. That's what we do here. Find hidden structures connecting unrelated fields, because the best insights come from the places nobody thinks to look. Subscribe if you want to see how Antarctic explorers understood remote team management better than most distributed companies, or how a 19th century railroad baron's playbook explains modern platform strategy perfectly. Next week covers what the British East India Company knew about platform economics that Uber learned the hard way. Drop a comment below. What's the most tribal loyalty over capability moment you've witnessed in a company? The moment where who you knew mattered more than what you could do.